V73 Saint Teresa saw something that most people who get married never stop to ask. She saw what happens to a couple when they actually help each other reach God. And what she described is not a poem, it is not a feeling. It is a documented account from one of the most carefully studied mystics in the history of Christianity, a woman who was investigated by the Spanish Inquisition, whose visions were examined by some of the greatest theological minds of the 16th century, and who, in the end, was declared a doctor of the Church by Pope Paul VI in 1970. One of only 4 women ever given that title. The things she saw were not small, they were not vague, and when it came to the union of spouses who choose holiness together, what she revealed is something that will make you rethink everything you thought you understood about why marriage exists at all. If you value documented spiritual history like this, subscribe now. It is the best way to support what we do here. And drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. We love knowing where you are. This content is deeply researched and draws from 2 primary sources. Saint Teresa's own autobiographical writings, compiled in the collected works of Saint Teresa of Avila by the Institute of Carmelite Studies in Washington, D.C., the gold standard scholarly edition of her texts, and The Interior Castle in its critical edition translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, Carmelite scholars who spent decades cross-referencing her original Spanish manuscripts. Not a general religious website, not a blog, the actual manuscripts. Now back to the story. Teresa de Ahumada y Cepeda was born on March 28, 1515 in Avila, a walled city in the heart of Old Castile, Spain, the 3rd of 9 children. Her father was rigidly pious. Her mother quietly read romance novels and hid them from her husband. Teresa was caught in the middle of both worlds from the moment she could walk. By the time she was 5 years old, she had already convinced her older brother Rodrigo to run away with her toward the land of the Moors so they could be martyred for the faith. An uncle caught them at the city gates and brought them back. Even at 5, she was reaching for something beyond the ordinary. Her mother died when Teresa was 13, 14 years old and already shaped by 2 contradictory forces: the hunger for God and the pull of the world. She loved books, clothes, conversations. She had a gift for friendship that would follow her everywhere. Her father, alarmed by the company she was keeping, sent her to the Augustinian convent in Avila for a year and a half. She was not sure about religious life. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila on November 2nd, 1536, at age 20, against her father's wishes. She later said she chose religious life not out of love, but out of fear. It was, she thought, the safest path to heaven for someone as drawn to the world as she was. She spent the next 18 years struggling. The convent was not cloistered. Nuns came and went. The parlor was a social gathering space. Teresa herself admitted she was drawn into conversations, into vanity, into distraction. She prayed on and off for nearly 2 decades without feeling she was going anywhere. Then, around 1554, she was 39 years old. She walked past a statue of Christ covered in wounds. Something broke open in her. She fell to her knees and wept for the first time with real sorrow. From that moment, the direction of her life shifted entirely and would not shift back. What followed over the next 28 years is one of the most documented records of mystical experience in church history. She heard locutions, which are interior words from God. She saw visions of Christ, of angels, of souls. She levitated during prayer and found it so embarrassing she begged the nuns to hold her down. She experienced the transverberation, the piercing of her heart by an angel's golden dart, which was later depicted in marble by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in the famous sculpture in Rome, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, completed in 1652. She entered states of union with God that left her incapable of speech or movement for hours at a time. And through all of it, she wrote. She wrote because her confessors told her to. She wrote the way a scientist records data, precisely, reluctantly, constantly checking herself, asking whether she might be deceived. Her confessors included some of the most rigorous theological minds of 16th century Spain. Among them, St. Peter of Alcantara, who confirmed her experiences as genuine, and St. John of the Cross, who would become her closest spiritual collaborator. The Inquisition examined her writings. The examiners found nothing heretical. Her obedience to the church was total. She submitted everything. Now here is where marriage enters the picture, and it enters hard. Teresa was not married. She was a nun. But the word marriage is at the absolute center of everything she discovered about the soul's journey toward God. Because according to Teresa, and this is not poetry, this is her theological framework, the soul is made to be united to God the way a bride is united to a bridegroom. And the deepest mystery she ever described is what she called the spiritual marriage. It takes place in the 7th mansion, the innermost room of what she called the interior castle. She began writing that book on June 2nd, 1577, in the convent of the Incarnation in Avila, and finished it on November 29th of the same year, 5 months, dictated under obedience to her superiors. The image she used for the soul is a castle made entirely of a single diamond or very clear crystal. Inside that castle are many rooms, or mansions, 7 levels of them, each one drawing the soul closer to the center where God himself dwells. The first 3 mansions are about the ordinary life of prayer, fighting sin, choosing God daily. The 4th and 5th are where the first real taste of God's presence begins, a quiet the mind cannot produce for itself. The 6th mansion is where the great purifications happen, the storms, the misunderstandings, the confusion, the feeling of abandonment. All of it is, Teresa says, God preparing the soul for something it cannot yet imagine. Think of it like a long engagement before a wedding. The 6th mansion is the engagement. The 7th is the wedding day. And the 7th mansion, that is the place. Teresa wrote that when God brings the soul into the 7th dwelling place, something happens that is unlike anything that has come before. She says God appears in the soul's center, not in an imaginative vision, but in an intellectual one, far more deep and permanent. And in that moment, she writes, the soul is made one with God, who is himself a spirit, like rain that falls into a river and becomes one and the same liquid, so that the river and the rainwater can no longer be separated. 2 lighted candles that join and become one flame. You cannot pull them apart anymore. This, Teresa says, is the closest thing to heaven that can exist, while the soul is still in a human body. She calls the 7th mansion a second heaven, not metaphor, her actual words, a second heaven. And she says the joy in this state is so supreme as to be indescribable. All the senses filled with bliss and sweetness that no description is possible. She wrote that at length and then said it was better to say no more about it. But here's the twist that changes everything about how you read all of this. Teresa is not describing something only saints or nuns can reach. She is describing the destination that every human soul is created for. And she is saying that the same bond that exists between a bridegroom and a bride, the same bond that human marriage is meant to reflect and mirror, is the very template God uses for his relationship with the soul. Human marriage, real marriage, marriage rooted in helping one another toward God, is not an obstacle to this kind of union. It is one of the clearest images of it that exists in the created world. And for spouses who understand that, who actually live it, the road to that 7th mansion runs straight through each other, not around each other, through. November 18th, 1572. Teresa herself received her own spiritual marriage to Christ at the age of 57. St. John of the Cross gave her communion that morning. He had broken the host, and she briefly wondered if he was testing her humility by giving her such a small piece. Then Christ spoke to her. She records it in her spiritual testimonies. Document 31. Christ said to her, "See this nail? It is a sign of our union. From this day on, you are my bride. Up to now you had not merited this, but now you will not only see me as your creator, your king, your God. From now on you will care for my honor as my true bride. My honor is yours, your glory is mine." Teresa writes that this favor produced such an effect in her that she could not contain herself and remained as though entranced for hours. That union never left her for the remaining 10 years of her life until her death in Alba de Tormes on October 4th, 1582. Those who surrounded her at the moment of death reported seeing a white dove pass from her mouth. They heard a great noise of joyful people, and then a multitude of resplendent figures entering her room, all dressed in white. She was 67 years old. She had founded 17 convents. She had written 3 books that would change the Church's understanding of mystical prayer forever. And she died the way she had said she wanted to die, in God. Now let us talk about what all of this means for married people. Because Teresa's vision is not separate from the life of a husband and wife. It is the very thing married life is designed to lead toward. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1661, states this directly. The sacrament of matrimony gives spouses the grace to love each other with the love with which Christ has loved his church. It perfects human love. It strengthens the indissoluble unity of the spouses, and it sanctifies them on the way to eternal life. This is not sentiment. This is official doctrine. The grace given to a married couple at their wedding is specifically ordered toward heaven, toward that 7th mansion, toward the union Teresa described. Think about that for a moment. The grace you receive at your wedding is aimed at union with God. And the person standing next to you on that day is your partner for the journey toward it. Not just your partner in life, your partner in the most serious task that any human being can undertake, getting to the other side of death and finding God there. Blessed Charles of Austria understood this exactly. On the night before his wedding to Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma, on October 21st, 1911, at the chapel of Castle Schwarzau in Austria, Charles turned to Zita and said, "Now we must help each other get to heaven." That was his wedding eve speech. Not a toast, not a poem, a mission statement. He was 24 years old. Zita was 19. They would go on to have 8 children. Charles would later become the last emperor of Austria and the ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, navigating the absolute nightmare of World War I. He worked tirelessly for peace. He was twice exiled from his throne. He died on April 1st, 1922, at age 35, of respiratory failure in poverty on the island of Madeira. His last words to Zita, "I love you endlessly." Zita wore black for the next 67 years of her life until her own death. She was never separated from him in her heart. Pope John Paul II beatified Charles on October 3rd, 2004. The Church chose as his feast day not the date of his death, but the date of his wedding, October 21st, because the Church understood that his holiness was inseparable from his marriage. His path to heaven ran through Zita. Her path ran through him. That is the theology of marriage lived in full view. Now let us go deeper, because Teresa's vision does not stop at the wedding day. It goes all the way through. It costs everything. And the couples who have actually reached that destination together show us what the price looks like in the real world. Before we continue, a quick reminder. If this kind of deep, documented spiritual history moves you, subscribe to the channel. It is the most direct way to support this work. And tell us in the comments what city you are coming from. We genuinely want to know. October 18th, 2015, St. Peter's Square in Rome, Pope Francis, surrounded by tens of thousands of faithful, declared two people saints in the same ceremony. Louis Martin and his wife Marie Azélie Guérin, known as Zélie. This was the first time in the history of the Catholic Church that a married couple was canonized together. Not one saint from a marriage, two saints together from the same marriage. The Church did this on purpose during the Synod on the Family, as a statement to the world. Louis was born in Bordeaux on August 22, 1823. He trained as a watchmaker. He had tried to enter religious life in the Augustinian Great St. Bernard Monastery, but could not master Latin in time, and his application was rejected. Zélie was born on December 23, 1831, in Normandy. She had tried to enter religious life with the Sisters of Charity, but was turned away due to respiratory problems. Two people who wanted to give their lives completely to God and found every institutional door closed to them, so they met each other instead, and God used that. They were married on July 13, 1858, at the Notre Dame Basilica in Alençon, France, after just 3 months of courtship. Their shared life began as the search for holiness that neither had been able to pursue alone. Cardinal José Saraiva, Martins of the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints, later said, Louis and Zélie understood that they could sanctify themselves not despite marriage, but through, in, and by marriage, and that their nuptials would be considered as the starting point for a mutual rise. Through, in, and by, not around, not after, through the marriage itself, through the difficulty, through the daily choice. They had 9 children. 4 died in infancy or very early childhood. That is a grief most people in the modern world cannot fully imagine. 4 small caskets, 4 times. And each time, Louis and Zélie placed their hope not in denial, but in the certainty of heaven. They wrote of seeing their lost children again there. They prayed this out loud. They believed this with the kind of faith that either cracks a person entirely or transforms them completely. For Louis and Zélie, it transformed them. The 5 daughters who survived all entered religious life. The youngest, born January 2nd, 1873, was Thérèse, Saint Teresa of Lisieux, the Little Flower, one of the most beloved saints in church history, a doctor of the church, patron of missionaries, whose spirituality, called the Little Way, the understanding that holiness is found in small daily acts of love rather than great dramatic heroics, changed how millions of human beings understand their relationship with God. And all of that began in the home of Louis Martin and Zélie Martin, in Alençon, at a kitchen table, in daily prayers, in how they talked to their children about the children who had died, in the marriage. Thérèse herself said it plainly, God gave me a father and mother more worthy of heaven than of earth. Louis gave up his career as a watchmaker to help Zélie run her Alencon lace business. By 1870, the business had become her enterprise entirely, and he joined it to support her. They attended daily mass, they fasted. They prayed the rosary together every night. They visited the sick. They welcomed the poor into their home on the Rue Saint-Blaise. And in December 1876, after 18 years of marriage, they learned that the swelling in Zélie's breast was advanced cancer. She had been aware of something wrong for 11 years. Zélie wrote to her sister-in-law after telling her family, I could not help from telling everyone everything. There was a grief-filled scene and everyone was crying, but I did not seem very upset, doing my work cheerfully as always. And yet I am quite far from deluding myself. My husband is inconsolable. In June 1877, Zélie took her 3 oldest daughters to Lourdes to pray for a cure. She entered the baths multiple times. The journey back home was miserable. She returned worse than when she left. She resigned herself entirely to God's will and died on August 28, 1877, in Alençon. She was 45 years old. Little Thérèse was 4. Louis sold the lace business, moved the family to Lisieux, watched his daughters enter religious life one by one, had 2 strokes in 1889 that partially paralyzed him. Cerebral arteriosclerosis followed. He showed signs of mental illness caused by the disease. He spent 3 years in a psychiatric hospital in Caen in conditions that would have humiliated a lesser man. And, he still said, of watching his daughters enter the convent while he suffered. It is a great, great honor for me that the good Lord desires to take all of my children. If I had anything better, I would not hesitate to offer it to him. Louis Martin died on July 29th, 1894. Zélie had been gone for 17 years. He had spent those 17 years alone, finishing the road she had started beside him. He never stopped walking. Pope Benedict XVI beatified them together in 2008. Pope Francis canonized them together in 2015. Their feast day is July 12th, the date of their wedding. Again, the Church is making a theological statement. The wedding is the beginning of the path to heaven. And for these two, the path led all the way there, both of them. Now back to Teresa. Because she did not just describe the destination, she described what the path looks like in specific, practical, almost uncomfortable detail. In the interior castle, especially in the descriptions of the 6th and 7th mansions, Teresa is explicit. The souls that reach the highest union with God are not the ones who avoided suffering. They are the ones who accepted it, who leaned into it, who found God precisely inside what they most wanted to escape. And for married people, that suffering is not separate from the marriage. It comes through the marriage, through the misunderstandings, through the arguments, through the moments when the other person is genuinely maddening and you choose to stay anyway, through the grief of watching someone you love suffer helplessly, through the long years of showing up when you do not feel like it. Teresa calls this the way of the cross, and she says it is the only road that goes all the way to the 7th mansion. She writes in the conclusion of The Interior Castle, chapter 4 of the 7th mansion, "The reason for prayer, my daughters, the purpose of this spiritual marriage, is the birth always of good works, not raptures, not visions, good works. The marriage, the union with God that Teresa experienced, does not end in mystical bliss and stillness. It ends in service, in love poured out. The joy and the service are the same thing at that level. Because at that level, the soul wants nothing for itself. It wants what God wants. And God wants souls, all the souls around it, including, most urgently, the soul of the person sleeping next to it every night. The Catechism of the Catholic Church puts this in its most precise form in paragraph 1660. The marriage covenant, by which a man and a woman form with each other an intimate communion of life and love, has been founded and endowed with its own special laws by the Creator. By its very nature, it is ordered to the good of the couple, as well as to the generation and education of children. Ordered. That word means aimed. The aim of marriage is the good of the couple. And the good of the couple is not comfort. It is not happiness in the ordinary sense of that word. It is heaven. It was always heaven. This is not modern spirituality. This is the oldest understanding of what marriage is for. St. John Chrysostom wrote about this in the 4th century, around the year 397. He wrote a letter to a young widow whose husband had died after just 5 years of marriage. He told her that God willed her to see her husband again in heaven, that she must remain steadfast in faith so she could achieve that destiny, and that her faithfulness here was the surest road to finding him there. Perpetual connection, not ended at death, completed through it. Now we reach the part that Teresa saw that most changes how you understand all of this. Teresa was not given visions of heaven only in the dramatic, ecstatic mode of levitation and burning darts. Some of her deepest insights came in what she called intellectual visions. Interior knowledge, given without image, pure understanding placed directly in the soul. And in these, she says, God revealed to her the logic of love, the reason why union with God is the highest joy, and why helping another soul toward that union is the highest act of love available to a human being while still alive. The grace given in the spiritual marriage, she writes in the 7th mansion, does not stay contained in the soul. It flows outward. From the bosom of the divinity, where God seems ever to hold this soul fast clasped, issue streams of milk, which solace all the servants of the castle. The soul in union with God becomes a source for those around it. It cannot help it. The love is too large to stay inside. It pours out through every action, every word, every choice. This is what spouses who help each other toward God are doing. They are becoming, together, a single source of grace that flows outward into their children, their neighbors, their whole community. The family built on real marriage, on the conscious, daily choice to help each other reach God, becomes what the Church has always called a domestic church. Not a metaphor, a real church. A place where the presence of God is encountered, welcomed, cultivated, and passed on to every soul that enters it. Louis and Zélie Martin did not just produce one saint, they produced Saint Teresa of Lisieux, whose influence has spread across the entire world. and whose little way changed how generations of ordinary people understand what it means to love God in the middle of an ordinary life. That began in a kitchen, in a home on the Rue Saint-Blaise in Alençon, France, in a marriage that took the sacrament seriously enough to build a life on it. The miracle that confirmed the canonization of Louis and Zélie was the inexplicable healing of a Spanish girl named Carmen Pérez Pons in Valencia, Spain, in 2008. Carmen was born on October 16th, the feast of Saint Teresa of Avila. After her birth, she suffered multiple severe medical complications that threatened her life. Her parents brought their prayers to a Carmelite monastery dedicated to Saint Teresa. The sisters recommended the healing of Carmen to the intercession of Louis and Zélie Martin, who had just been beatified 4 days earlier. 8 medical experts later testified in the canonization process that the healing was inexplicable by natural causes. The Church accepted it, and the canonization followed on October 18th, 2015. October 16th, the feast of Saint Teresa of Avila, the day this child was born and the day the miracle began. The connections between Teresa's vision and the reality of holy marriage run all the way down to the calendar dates. Here is what all of this means in the simplest terms possible. Marriage is not just companionship. It is not just raising children or building a family or having someone to grow old with. It is not a social contract or legal arrangement or feeling of love that may or may not last. According to the Church's oldest and most consistent teaching, marriage is a path, a specific road toward a specific destination. That destination is the seventh mansion, the union with God that Teresa described. The joy that all the senses fill with such bliss and sweetness that no description is possible. That is where the road ends. And for spouses who walk it together, the road is not walked alone. It is walked side by side, each one pulling the other forward on the days when the other cannot move. This is why Blessed Charles said what he said to Zita the night before their wedding in 1911. Now we must help each other get to heaven, because he understood that the person you marry is not incidental to your salvation. They are your primary partner in it, your greatest help or your greatest obstacle, depending entirely on how seriously you both take the sacrament. This is not a romantic idea. It is a sober responsibility and a staggering gift. Teresa knew what the stakes were. She had seen what happens to souls that do not reach the seventh mansion. She had seen the vision of hell she described in her autobiography, chapter 32, the place she believed had been prepared for her had God not intervened in her life at 39 years old. She knew the road was real, and the destination was real, and the danger of missing it was real. And she knew that for married people, the surest and most direct road runs straight through faithfulness to the one they married, through choosing every single day to help that person get to where God is. And it is worth pausing here to say what Teresa says about the person in the seventh mansion, because people assume that someone in that kind of union with God is walking around glowing, untouched by the mess of ordinary life. Teresa corrects this directly. She writes in the 4th chapter of the seventh mansion, the very last chapter of the interior castle, that the soul in the seventh mansion does not lose its need to work, to suffer, or to serve. In fact, it is freed, she says, from the obsession with its own spiritual experiences, and instead becomes almost entirely focused outward, on God's honor, on the good of souls around it. She writes that these advanced souls carry the sufferings they see around them far more than their own. They feel the sins of the world like a wound. They cannot be comfortable, while others are far from God. The union makes them not more withdrawn from the world, but more urgently engaged with it. For a married person, this is crucial to understand. The deeper you move into genuine holiness, the more you feel the spiritual state of your spouse. The more you notice when they are drifting. The more you intercede. The more you find small, invisible ways to pull them back toward God without making it about yourself or your spiritual superiority. Louis Martin did this for Zélie when she was dying. He sat with her through the nights of unbearable pain without collapsing into his own grief. He held the family together so she could die in peace, with her daughters cared for, with her work finished. That is the seventh mansion in a kitchen. That is spiritual marriage dressed in ordinary clothes. Gianna Beretta Molla was a pediatrician in Milan, Italy. She was born on October 4th, 1922, the same feast day as St. Francis of Assisi. She married Pietro Molla in 1955. Her husband Pietro later wrote of her, "Holy virtue, the gentle goodness and affection of Gianna, all her cares. Give me the full joy and serenity which I asked of Jesus on my wedding day." With Gianna, I'm sure of forming a truly Christian family on which she will know how to draw the most beautiful heavenly graces. Gianna was canonized by Pope John Paul II on May 16, 2004. She died in 1962 after refusing medical treatment that would have saved her life, but ended the life of her unborn daughter. She chose her daughter's life over her own. Her husband Pietro lived until 2022, dying at age 96, 60 years after Gianna's death. He attended her canonization. He spent 6 decades as a witness to what it meant to be married to someone who took the sacrament that seriously. He said she showed him what love actually is. Not a feeling, a death, a complete gift of self. The same thing Teresa describes in the Seventh Mansion. The same thing the Catechism describes as the grace of the sacrament. These are not exceptional cases of superhuman people who were born different from everyone else. Teresa herself was drawn to gossip and vanity until she was nearly 40. Louis Martin failed to enter religious life because he could not learn Latin in time. Zélie Martin was turned away from the Sisters of Charity because of her breathing. Charles of Austria was a head of state navigating the worst war in the history of Europe at the time. Gianna Beretta Molla was a pediatrician, a working mother with 3 children and a husband. They were ordinary people who decided to take seriously what the sacrament they received was actually for. And that decision, made every morning for years and years, is what brought them to the place Teresa described. The second heaven, the seventh mansion. The union with God that no language can fully hold. That is the joy she saw when spouses help each other to eternity. It is not a feeling, it is not a metaphor. It is the seventh mansion. 2 lighted candles joining. Rain that falls into a river and cannot be separated from it anymore. Rain that came down from the clouds. River that was always already flowing toward the sea. In 1858, Louis Martin met Zélie Guérin on the bridge of St. Leonard in Alençon. According to his daughter, Celine's later testimony, preserved in the cause for their beatification, he heard an interior voice say as he passed her, "This is she who is destined for me." He pursued an introduction through Zélie's family. 3 months later, they were married. 19 years of marriage followed. 4 children in heaven, 5 daughters in convents. One of those 5 daughters became a doctor of the church. When Zélie died, Louis had 17 more years of suffering ahead of him, alone, sick, humiliated, losing his mind to disease. He walked every one of those years toward the same destination she had walked toward beside him. When Pope Francis canonized them in Rome on October 18th, 2015, they were not separated by the grave. The church was declaring what Louis and Zélie had known in Alençon from the very beginning of their life together. They were heading to the same place, and they got there, both of them. Not a grave, a door. And on the other side of it, something that sounds exactly like what Teresa of Avila described in her very last years of life when the spiritual marriage had permanently settled in her soul. An unalterable peace, a joy too large for words, the presence of God so constant and so close that the soul forgets to be afraid of anything ever again. That is what spouses can give each other. That is the actual gift of the sacrament. Not a feeling, not a ceremony, a road to the thing Teresa saw, a road that runs right through the middle of a normal life, a kitchen table, a set of children, a business, a sickness, a loss, a long, faithful night. And then, for those who walk it all the way to the end, a door, together. Teresa died in Alba de Tormes on October 4th, 1582. She was 67 years old. She had founded 17 convents across Spain in 20 years of extraordinary, relentless effort. She had crossed deserts, traveled in open carts in summer heat and winter cold, negotiated with nobles and bishops and hostile prioresses. She had been sick for most of her adult life with a heart condition that caused pains sharp enough to deprive her of consciousness. And she had done all of it from the seventh mansion. From inside the union she described, from inside the joy. The joy did not take her away from the work. It drove her into it. Because the love that fills the seventh mansion is not a love that wants to sit still. It is a love that cannot help but move toward every soul that is still outside it. When she died, her confessor, Father Antonio de Jesus, was present. He and the community later testified that the scent of extraordinary fragrance filled the cell at the moment of her death, that her face, which had been pale and exhausted from the illness of her final months, became in death radiant. Her biographers document that her body remained incorrupt for years, physical evidence that the Church examines in every cause for canonization. The body of Teresa of Avila, the woman who described the seventh mansion, the woman who received the spiritual marriage at age 57, did not decay the way ordinary bodies do. The Church does not require this as proof of holiness, but it records it. And it asks the obvious question, what happened inside that woman that her body held like that? The same question can be asked of every married couple that reaches the end of a long, faithful life together. What happened inside them? What was built? What remains? Louis Martin, in a psychiatric hospital in Caen, 3 years, partially paralyzed, stripped of everything that had identified him in the world, and still saying, "It is a great honor for me that the good Lord desires to take all of my children." That is not a man destroyed by his suffering. That is a man who has arrived somewhere inside himself that suffering cannot reach. That is the seventh mansion in a hospital bed. That is what the marriage built in him, piece by piece, year by year, grief by grief. And it held